when we're talking about ICE, we're talking about federal agents. And what's really critical and a big difference here is the need for a warrant. And I hear that a lot from our audience about whether or not these ICE agents have a warrant and whether or not that has been displayed, has been shared, and in what situations those are needed. So, well, how bad are these people? We're hearing from the Department of Homeland Security about these violent criminals that are being taken off the streets. They're worst of the worst. But then we're also hearing these other stories. And so, just to clarify that a little bit, as much as I possibly can, when you have these battling statistics, what the Department of Homeland Security is saying is, in general, anybody that's in our custody has broken the law, we believe, in some way. Let's talk a little bit about Greenland. I don't know if I ever thought that I would be alive in a time where the United States would take over another piece of property, for lack of a better term. What would that actually look like? And the reality is that we may be in a situation where we could see that. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to Scoop. It is Tuesday, January 20th, and a significant day for us all to take in, because where were you last January 20th? Where were you January 20th, 2025? I know exactly where I was. I was right in front of you because it was Inauguration Day for President Trump. And it may be difficult to believe that here we have a full year of the Trump administration. We're marking that today. Some may call it an anniversary. Some may have other choice terms. Either way, it's been exactly a year of the second iteration of the Trump administration. And there's certainly a lot to reflect upon and a lot of big stories in front of us. Ironically, today, we're also dealing with a geomagnetic storm. The irony of this, I don't know how to make sense of it. A geomagnetic storm is when we like to affectionately describe it as a sun burp. We don't know if the sun has indigestion. Either way, the sun shoots off, burps up a flare, if you will, of energy, of particles, energetic particles, sort of like a cloud, if you can imagine that way. And it comes towards Earth. And because of Earth's magnetic sphere, because we have that, any sort of these energetic particles can sort of disrupt a little bit of what's happening here on Earth. Imagine if you have magnets on a table and one just shifts just sort of slightly, it could kind of move a couple others. This is what I'm imagining. I don't know if it's exactly scientifically correct, but it's the best I can do in this exact moment. So a geomagnetic storm is taking place, and there was a severe warning. And in fact, the solar radiation storm is the most severe that we've seen in more than 20 years. And if this storm reaches Earth in strength, if we have this, the particles come to Earth with a certain amount of severity or a certain amount of strength, it can impact our satellites. It can impact our radio, GPS. So if you're having anything strange happen today, it may be due to that, or it may not. It might just be 2026, which has turned into be a very eventful year. I was thinking about, the year of news so far, a year of the Trump administration. And I was thinking, well, it's a year in a calendar year, but it feels like 150 years in journalism years, kind of like dog years. And then that led me down a path to ask the question, well, how do we come up with dog years? How did we ever come up with that estimate? Can I just share this fun fact with you today? Because it's very odd. Apparently, no one really knows the 7-to-1 estimate when we say it's 7 years of a dog for every 1 year of a human, sort of like a guess that came up in the 1950s. But even in the 13th century, we were looking to estimate the age of animals related to humans, and we were a little bit more generous, saying it was like 8 or 9-to-1. So either way, I'm just going to tell you a year between 2025 and 2026 is about 150 years in journalism years. That's what it feels like. It feels like we've covered that much news in this short period of time. And I like this idea of solar flares, even though I don't like the idea of a geomagnetic storm, because I feel like we have enough on our plates with the weather as it is. I know a lot of you are experiencing very cold weather across the United States. This is going to be a big story, by the way, in the next 10, 12 days, because we're seeing a broad swath of the country really affected by a wintry sort of ribbon that's across the country that could affect many states, and that can affect travel. And we know when there's a big weather story, it can affect so many different parts of the economy as well. So that's something that we're going to be watching. But I like this idea, this imagery of solar flares, because it feels like that's what's happening in the news all the time. You get a story that flares up and then suddenly goes away and flares up again and goes away. And each time that flare comes up, it feels like a big emergency or something that you really got to learn about. And sometimes it's difficult to wrap your head around it. And as soon as you get a chance to do that, it's already gone. And that's what the last year sort of felt like, these flare ups of really important, significant news. So we're going to use that today as a bit of a analogy and try to work through some of the stories and pull those flares down to a temperature that we can take in a little bit of news related to these events. The two big stories we're going to focus on today have to do with what's happening and continues to happen in Minneapolis, also what happens to do in Greenland or around Greenland or about Greenland. And as true with any of these stories, we have a lot of offshoots from these stories to tackle. So we have a lot in front of us. How many of you have watched college football? Anybody big college football fans out there? That is an amazing story. The University of Indiana, undefeated season, first national championship. So we're coming into the week with a great sports story of what was once underdogs that now are champions. And it's a good reminder of how quickly the news can change. On that, I just want to share something really quick with you before we jump into the stories of this week, because I thought to myself this weekend, I was part of a very unique event. I thought to myself this weekend, I wish I could show this event to Smarter News. And then I took it a second step, which is I wish I could show this story to the nation. Because if every news broadcast started with this story, instead of jumping right into a protest in Minneapolis or a debate over social media posts, all of these are big stories, by the way, would we have a different perspective about what was happening in front of us? So we're going to do that. Let's just do a quick moment. We're going to take a quick divergent little trip, and then we're going to go right back to the news. But I was part of a historic event at Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas, and it was the 20th year reunion of the Ready First Combat Team. The Ready First Combat Team includes sailors, airmen, Marines, Navy SEALs, who were part of a major operation in Iraq in 2006. So this is the 20-year reunion of the beginning of this operation that took place 2006 into 2007. And what's important to know about this team, this group of people, but also this operation that was ongoing at the time in Iraq, is many credit this battle in Ramadi, a city in Iraq, for turning the tide of the war. And we'll get into, what does winning look like in Iraq in just a second, but I just want you to think about that. There was a time during the Iraq War when it was really a question about what is success there? What is success going to look like? Al-Qaeda had taken over such a broad part of the country, Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups. And in fact, there was one written statement by a Marine Corps official or officials who said this: the social and political situation has deteriorated to a point that U.S. and Iraqi troops are no longer capable of militarily defeating the insurgency in Al-Anbar, which is a key province in Iraq. So the Marines were basically saying, we're not going to win here. We can't defeat these terrorists. And that was the sentiment. And then in comes this operation led by Lieutenant General Sean McFarland and the Ready First Combat Team. My husband was part of a Navy SEAL team that worked alongside these soldiers. And in my house, on the walls, you're going to see pictures of the Ready First Combat Team. You're going to hear my husband talk about this group of individuals because it was so critical to their operations as the SEAL teams to go in small teams in the dark of night, often set up different positions so that this broader team, this bigger team by the Army could come through and take parts of the city back. So this was a very critical turning point of the Iraq War. And this 20th year reunion had more than 1,000 people in attendance this weekend at Fort Bliss. And I was able to see that. And I'm showing a picture on the screen of part of the crowd of people. It was incredible. 10 years ago, when they did a 10-year reunion, apparently just a few dozen people showed up. But this was a time when you had so many different people from all across the country and across the world come together. And I was so struck by this group of people because they looked so different. They were all shapes and sizes. They had the long beards. They had the clean shaven faces. They had the tattoos on the necks and the hands. They had the guys that looked like they walked off of, an army set, a movie set. It was all sorts of different people that clearly loved each other and were willing to put their lives on the line for each other. And this was such an incredible, moving event to be part of. Part of the event was also a memorial wall that showed just about 100 soldiers that were killed, service members that were killed during this time, which it was an incredibly deadly battle. But ultimately, it was thought to be part of what was called the Anbar Awakening, which again was the way that the local tribes or the local organizations in Iraq decided to work with the US military to overturn the terrorist groups. And so this was, again, a historic moment in the Iraq War and a really interesting moment to be part of. I'm also just going to show you really quick. This is my husband and myself in the back of a Bradley armored vehicle, which, by the way, is a lot tighter than I thought. I thought there'd be a little extra room in there. But it only fits so many. I did say to my husband, this could be kind of good to roll down the streets with our kids because I'd feel very comfortable and safe. But it was the ability to even get into some of these vehicles to get an understanding. But what was it really like to be on the ground if you're an 18-year-old, 19-year-old, part of the Army and part of this pivotal battle? So the reason why I wanted to mention that to you today is not only to honor the lives lost during that battle and many, many hundreds more injured, and the significance of this part of history that we haven't really taken a lot of time to reflect upon. But what I loved about this is the camaraderie that you saw from this diverse group of people that just reminded me about how amazing America is. Most militaries don't look like that. Most militaries do not have the resources, the spirit, and the individualism that's part of the U.S. military. And to see so many different paths cross in such a significant time in their lives, and also the history of the United States, was a really special thing to see. There was this amazing toast that happened at a dinner. All these guys got up on the top of their tables and were toasting different things. I just thought, this is what America needs. We just need a moment of perspective to think about what matters most. And that is the American dream and each other and taking care of each other and fighting for what's right and what's good. The debate about the Iraq War and, what we were doing there initially and whether or not it was a win or a loss, that's been heavily debated. I'm not going to get into that today. I will tell you that the retired Lieutenant General Sean McFarland, who led the Ready First combat team in Iraq in 2006, also was the leader about 10 years later when ISIS had then moved into the area of Iraq, and we went back to try to repel ISIS, which we did. And we could, a measure of success is just to look at that part of the world. It's a very an area of the world where there's a lot of conflict, the Middle East. And imagine if the entire state of Iraq or the entire state of Syria had fallen to terrorist organizations. So we were not dealing with those governments, questionable as they are, but dealing with terrorist groups. How different the world could look at this time when we're looking at stories like what's happening in Iran or what's happening in places like Gaza or Lebanon. So it is something to reflect upon. I just wanted to share that with you because it was such a unique experience, and I wish everybody could see that and just have pride in the country and looking at all these individuals whose lives were forever changed and who forever changed history in Iraq. So wanted to pay a little tribute to them and the capability and the ability of the American citizen to work for something bigger than themselves. We don't talk about that a lot. And when I was hearing in college football, we die for each other on the field. We do this for each other. I was thinking about the team, the Ready First combat team, thinking, no, there's teams that actually do die for each other. And it's part of the U.S. military. So just wanted to share that today, a little perspective when we're hearing so much volatile language about so many different stories. And asking that question, what is this all for? And what does America stand for? These are big questions that need to be fruitfully debated. That's important. We want to see that. But also, we want to make sure that as a member of the press, we are providing enough context and perspective that these stories can be fully debated by the U.S. citizens. And I'm seeing in some cases that we're not doing a great job of that. So I want to touch on that a little bit today, especially the situation in Minneapolis, because there's so many different ways to look at that story. So let's get started. I want to give you a couple just kind of rundown of things to know about this week. Really important. Remember that the government runs out of funding January 30th, and we need to get all these funding bills passed in order to keep the government up and running. There has been some progress. In fact, 8 out of 12 spending bills, about that amount, have been passed by Congress. So we're getting there, but we still have some really big spending packages to think about, including funding for the Department of Homeland Security, which has been a flashpoint, as you know, funding in the Pentagon. So there's some big debates ahead, but about 10 days until the deadline, we have some progress and some bigger questions about negotiations happening on the horizon. I saw that there was some progress potentially for the Department of Homeland Security funding. Sometimes we don't know. There's such large bills. You have to look through and find out what's going on in each one and where spending is going. According to some reporting from Fox News, there'd be $10 billion for ICE as part of the funding for part of the Department of Homeland Security, which is a point of contention because some Democrats would like to see ICE not funded at all. So that funding looks like it's in there for right now at the early stage of this bill, which has to meander its way through Congress. And that there's a report, though, that body cameras would be part of the funding for ICE agents. Many of you have asked about whether or not ICE wears body-worn cameras. And I just want to show you this policy, that there is a policy in place for these agents to wear body-worn cameras. But there's been a lack of resources discussed, that there's not enough money to issue cameras to every single ICE law enforcement personnel. So what we're seeing a lot of, as you can tell, is what's happening from a cell phone perspective, which can be helpful, but maybe incomplete. And so that's something to watch. We're going to continue to watch the funding because of the critical stories around that. We do have the Supreme Court back in session this week, and they're looking at a very interesting case today. It's ongoing as I'm actually doing this report. It's regarding gun laws, and it's focusing on a law in Hawaii, but because of laws in other states like California and New York, what happens in this case could affect other states which have stricter gun laws. So this is about where you can conceal carry. And if you're on private property that's open to the public, what is the presumption about being able to conceal carry a gun? If you're walking into a private property, it could be up to the private owner about whether or not you can carry a gun. You may see that in certain situations where there's a post about whether or not you can carry a gun, or, certain ordinances about that. This is an interesting case because it's a question about how it can be applied, or what is on the onus of the individual carrying the weapon, what's on the onus of the private property owner because it is open to the public. What does that look like? It was a very interesting discussion in front of the Supreme Court today. So that's something to watch in the future about when we get a decision on that and whether it can affect some of these states. Not all states, because every state has different gun laws, but in these particular states, what does that actually look like? Also, just wanted to mention this, the Customs and Border Protection. We're talking a lot about the border, but I do want to show you as we get our regular reports from them about, what does it look like down at the U.S. southern border. We got our latest information for the month of December. And I wanted to show you something, not just looking at this month, but just in general. As we know, the border is a big area of focus for the Trump administration. I'll go ahead and pull this up for you. It's our handy dandy graph that we've used over the last several years that will give us an idea of what does it look like at the border. And I noticed a trend I just want to point out to you. I have a couple things to go to the Department of Homeland Security about. This is one of them. So this line here, this blue line, signifies 2026. And the government year starts in October, ends in September. So it's not January to December. It starts in October, ends in September. So now we have just a couple months into 2026, and we're seeing roughly 30,000 encounters, nationwide encounters at our borders. So that includes the southern border, northern border, and otherwise. What's interesting is this consistency of this number is right below 31,000. So October, 30,500, November, 30,300, December, 30,000, nearly 700. So the consistency of that number, I'm curious about. Why is it 30,000? Especially because if you look back at June and July and August, you were seeing about 5,000 fewer encounters. So that even though this graph in 2026 shows a flat line, which is true, and way lower than 2025 at the same time, it's worth pointing that out. October, November, December of 2025. So a year ago, from October, November, December of last year, you were seeing, 4 times that number of encounters going into the election of 2024, and eventually the inauguration of President Trump in January. You saw the numbers go way down. So they started at 300,000 in 2024 in October. In 2025, it was 140,000. So cut basically in half. And now we've cut it more in half again, um, way lower than it was historically. So it is lower historically compared to the year before, but it is up from previous months during the Trump administration. I'm just sort of curious about that, to see what was the reason. Sometimes it's something as simple as like weather related, or it could be as simple as, there was a certain operation that took place or a certain group of people that were coming across at one time for whatever reason, and that can skew the numbers. But I'm curious about that. So I wanted you to see that, because although we're talking a lot about customs and border protection, we're not talking a lot about the border. We're talking about immigration enforcement in American cities. So I just wanted you to have that perspective as well. So more on that in just a moment. Real quick here, Davos. What is Davos? We talk about Davos in the news like everybody knows what it is. Well, Davos is a place in Switzerland, and once a year it becomes a hotspot for the rich and powerful. Quite frankly, the rich and powerful. It's a small, sleeping um, ski village, Davos, Switzerland, except for this time during the World Economic Forum. Apologies to those that live in Davos and don't consider it that way. But we only really talk about Davos in the news when we have this huge meeting that takes place there. And it's become a place where people come and present new ideas, new business ventures, new policies. It's where world leaders gather, give a speech. That's what the president's going to do on Wednesday. People are really looking forward to that, especially because of our relationship right now in the world stage with Europe, where in this particular conference, it's a lot of European leaders. There's people are going to be really listening carefully to President Trump, and there's a lot of meetings that happen on the sidelines. You never know who you're going to grab coffee with. Little cappuccino in Switzerland, talk about some tariff policy. So that's taking place this week, and you will see a lot of the U.S. cabinet members there as well making speeches. So when you see news coming from Davos, know that's the reason why. It's because they're all gathering in this one spot. And I've never been, but it looks like it's probably pretty fun. You get to jump to a few different sessions, world leaders speaking, or someone has a new business idea, or they're talking about a certain topic, and you're able to learn a lot. A lot of media organizations have setups there for the entire week, and they'll get periodic interviews, and they'll cover the live events. And so this is an area where you continue to see a lot of traditional media invest a lot of time, because it's such a concentrated place with so many powerful people. So on that, I just wanted to make sure that you knew that was taking place while we have lawmakers back here at home working through, trudging through a lot of the spending information that maybe is not going to get as much coverage, but it's going to be really critical to keeping the government open and funded. Jan asked a great question about how is an encounter defined when I was talking about the border there. And what's happening with our border numbers. And this is a great sort of channel into what's happening in Minneapolis. An encounter is when someone is encountered at the U.S. border by law enforcement who doesn't have legal status. And the reason why we use the term encounter is because they may not be arrested, they may not be detained, they may be allowed to pursue asylum in the United States. And so we need an umbrella term to say, hey, that person was encountered by the US government, a representative of the US government in some way. We don't know what happens to them after that point. We do get some data, by the way, from Customs and Border Protection. In fact, I have some of it. Let me go ahead and pull it back to the previous screen where the press release is. One of the things that the Trump administration really wants to talk about is that they do not do parole releases. So in the past, because let's say there were so many people, let's say 300,000 people were encountered by Border Patrol, they could only detain and remove so many. Some were allowed into the country on parole, saying, okay, fine, if it sounds like you could have an asylum case here, so we are going to release you to your family. Let's say you have family in New York, you can go to New York, but you're going to need to appear to state your case at a later date. And so there would be people that would be legally allowed to stay temporarily pursuing an asylum claim. And this was a form of parole. So what the Trump administration is saying is that they have 0 parole releases in December compared to over 7,000 released by Border Patrol under the Biden administration in December of 2024. So they're just saying that they're not allowing that. It's much harder to enter the country without legal status and state your case, whatever that may be, for staying in the United States of America. So that's what's happening at the US border. But really, the focus on immigration and customs enforcement is happening in these other cities that we're seeing, whether it was in Los Angeles early on in the Trump administration in New York, we saw that, but also now seeing it in Minneapolis, which continues to be such an area of a lot of controversy. So I want to spend a little time here again today, mainly to show you a few different perspectives from the ground in Minneapolis, and also show you where we could be doing a better job as a member of the media to highlight some of the unknowns and perhaps ask some better questions about what's actually happening there on the ground. Because as all of you know, what you're seeing on your screens is very volatile. But we hear from members of our Smart News community, wait a minute, this volatility is contained to a particular area in the city. It's not everywhere. And yes, there's conflicts, but there's also peaceful life. And we're not getting a totally complete picture of that. So there's a couple things I just want to review real quick, because we have received so much information about Customs and Border Patrol and what they're doing on the ground, what they're able to do legally, what they're not able to do legally. And in many cases, the news media, along with everyday citizens, we're using what we know about law enforcement as a guide. And that works in some cases, and it doesn't work in other cases, because when we're talking about ICE, we're talking about federal agents. And what's really critical and a big difference here is the need for a warrant. And I hear that a lot from our audience about whether or not these ICE agents have a warrant and whether or not that has been displayed, has been shared, and in what situations those are needed. So one of the big things to know about ICE agents is that they don't always need a warrant. In fact, in very specific situations, they need a warrant. But in many situations, they don't need a warrant at all. They're able to use their discretion about when to stop a U.S. citizen. They don't need to show you a warrant. They just need to have a reasonable cause to stop someone to ask their immigration status. They also do not need a warrant to go into a private business. That would, if you have law enforcement on your property, you would think, wait a minute, you need a warrant. But there's something called a worksite audit, and that does not require a criminal or civil warrant by an ICE agent. They can just show up at a workplace and say that they are going to do an audit of who's working there and who has legal status. So these are little nuggets of news to know, because some of these areas of this story are getting conflated, where there's outrage. You see outrage. They don't have a warrant. They're stopping these people that don't have a warrant. They actually legally don't need to have a warrant in most cases. I'm going to get to an exception of that in just a second, because it is also important to know when they do. I want to play for you just a soundbite that I heard. I was speaking about veterans earlier, a soundbite that I saw on social media myself this weekend. And I think it's a great example of a really important perspective on the story that everyone should consider, and a really great example of how the press can do a better job of fleshing out a story so you have more context and perspective to make up your own mind about what's going on. So as I was, going through Instagram this weekend, this is what I saw. I'm going to play for you this 90 seconds, and then we're going to talk about it.
I'm a U.S. veteran. I'm a citizen. For once in my life, I'm thinking I'm back in Afghanistan. So really think about that implication. It's not a combat zone. This is America.
What happened?
It's just like we hear, they're running around and they came to our facility. Luckily, we saw them across the street walking over here. Because of the state of the world right now, we have contingency plans on how to protect our people. Thankfully, we were able to lock our doors and deny them entrance.
They didn't have warrants then?
No warrants. They're
coming here on the off chance?
Yeah, indiscriminately, just your skin tone, your type of job and everything, that's what they're targeting.
They took one of your employees?
Yes. So, unfortunately, we don't know what's going to happen to him. It's he pop up and disappear. So we have to let his family know and wish them the best and try to support them as much as possible. We are a family here. That's what we try to really push in the sense of this business. We're a family-owned business. We're local. Everybody here is family. So seeing this happen is very detrimental. I mean, my staff is emotionally wrecked. It's not something you're used to. It's not the America I fought for.
When you say it feels like Afghanistan, the threat level, the trauma, is that what you're talking about?
Well, let's put it this way. When you're driving around looking over your shoulder constantly for threats, when you're constantly looking at the person, whether they're going to be a threat to you, your life, your state of being, yeah, absolutely. That's what we were trained to do. Are they going to hurt me, cause me harm? Yes, no, and you move on. I'm not saying that's what we should be thinking or doing. Absolutely not. But my own traumas take me that way. And there's a lot more veterans out there, brothers and sisters, who think and feel the same way. It's not a combat zone. This is America. We have the police here. We have laws. None of them are being followed. None of them are being implemented. It's honestly a disgrace to our country. This is not what I fought for. I don't stand for this.
So I don't have the name of this individual. We were actually looking to identify him and find out, what sort of business does he run? What else can we know about his story? Because he's giving a very emotional, very important perspective about how one citizen feels about what's happening in their own community. And what a perspective to have from somebody who was in a combat zone, who says that he feels like he's back there again. And that really is an emotional testimonial, and it provokes a certain amount of emotion when you listen to it. And I listened to it several times, but then I had more questions. And here's where these questions are important. It doesn't take away from the value of his perspective or the emotion that comes from it. I'm not trying to devalue this. What I am trying to say is, if you're seeing this sort of footage over and over again, here's some of the things that we want to ask. Well, what kind of business does he run? What should we know about this business? How many people without legal status does he have working for him? What does that look like? If they're working without legal status, what sort of wages do they get paid? Are they being treated appropriately because they don't have legal status? Or are they getting paid under the table? What about taxes? How do taxes pay in here? Like, there's all sorts of additional stories questions to ask on this. There's all sorts of additional questions to ask that feel important here. And we're not really getting that full picture. Why would I ask those questions? Well, what happens if this person's giving a perspective and based on, less than 2 minutes, you're like, this is a great guy. We want to hear more from him. But what happens if he's not someone that's employing people in a way that's fair or is respectful? He sounds like he is. But what if he's not? And what kind of work are they being required to do? It feels like we should know more about this. If this is a restaurant or if this is a factory, it might give us a little more perspective as to, what's happening behind closed doors. This is where the warrant comes up, because he says he shut the doors. ICE did not break into his facility, whatever that is, but he probably should know that they could come in and do an audit. Where was this individual taken? He said that they took this person. Well, was the person released later? Were they asked questions? Did they, quote unquote, disappear? Or was there a reason? Is there any background to know about this individual that they should have had an interaction with law enforcement in some way? That may become more relevant when you hear the statistics in just a moment here from the Department of Homeland Security and some of the debate about these statistics. There was a great question on our live chat about probable cause. So let me just tell you a little bit about this. An arrest involves law enforcement taking someone into custody and requires probable cause. So if you're being detained, there needs to be a reason. Probable cause, the person has committed a crime. Whereas detention involves a temporary hold to investigate when there is a reasonable suspicion. That's a lower standard than probable cause, that a person has committed a crime. So in both cases, you get a probable cause or reasonable suspicion that law enforcement can take someone off the street and hold them for a certain period of time. What that period of time looks like, what are the conditions of that? These are additional questions raised by critics of ICE about what this all looks like. So this is not to try to explain away and justify what ICE is doing here, but it is important to know what the law is. Because you and I, if we're American citizens and someone says you have to come with me and there's probable cause, you're like, wait, what are you talking about? For federal law enforcement, they could have you, regardless of your citizenship status, go with them. And I don't know how many of us knew that before these clashes were taking place, because we're not used to federal agents like this on our city streets. So it's important to know the law. Can immigration officers arrest U.S. citizens without a warrant? Yes, they can, if they have reasonable grounds to believe the person has committed a felony, not just an immigration-related felony. So, for example, I'm just going to use the stranger, we don't know their name, or the person that was detained by this person that was interviewed by Sky News. Let's say the person was a citizen, it doesn't sound like they were, but let's say that they were, but there was reasonable grounds to believe they committed a terrible crime, a felony, then yes, immigration officers can arrest them. Also, if the person is in the act of committing a criminal offense, so not just an immigration-related offense, but is doing something in the presence of a law enforcement officer, a federal law enforcement officer, then it would make sense that they would be arrested. Also, this is interesting. They could be arrested. Immigration officers can, quote, interrogate any alien. Alien is a legal term that is often used for someone without legal status. Interrogate any alien or person believed to be an alien as to his right to be or to remain in the United States. This means that even though ICE cannot arrest them, they can detain them without a warrant to investigate their legal status. That gives ICE broad power to take someone into their custody and talk to them about their immigration status and uncover whether or not they have permission to be in the country. This idea about what does breaking the law look like came up in a conversation this weekend with Secretary Noem on CBS's Face the Nation. And one of you asked us a great question about this, about, well, wait a minute. We're being told by the Trump administration that the people that are being arrested or detained are really bad dudes and women. But they're really bad guys, whoever they are. Like, they're getting off the streets because they're the bad guys. But then we're hearing a completely different story, that someone's grandmother is being taken into custody, or a student is being taken into custody, and they don't seem to have a criminal background. So what do the statistics show? What do the statistics show? And this was the question that was asked to Secretary Noem. Well, what are the backgrounds of the individuals that you're taking into custody, or that you're detaining, or that you're arresting? So I want you to listen to what she says here.
Every single individual has committed a crime, but 70% of them have committed or have charges against them on violent crimes and crimes that they are charged with or have been convicted of that have come from other countries, that are here illegally, first of all, and then they have committed a criminal act while they've been here or in their home countries as well.
It's not 70%.
Yes, it is. It absolutely is.
70% of everyone
you guys
have
keep
detained
changing your percentage. You pick and choose what numbers you think work, but that is the facts, is that 70% of the people that we have detained have charges against them or have been convicted of charges, and they need to be brought to justice. And we're going to keep doing that no matter how much you guys keep lying and don't tell the public the truth. It absolutely is that these law enforcement officers are out there every day doing the work to protect the American people, and they will keep doing that because they believe in enforcing the law, which is exactly what President Trump has charged them with.
Okay. Well, our reporting is that 47%, based on your agency's own numbers, 47% have criminal convictions against them. But let's talk about the other numbers.
You're wrong again. Absolutely. We'll get you the correct numbers so you can use them in the future.
I just wanted to play the beginning of this again. I want you to listen to the way Secretary Noem is describing that 70% statistic.
Every single individual has committed a crime, but 70% of them have committed or have charges against them on violent crimes.
Okay, so committed or charges against them. So what she's saying is every individual that's in custody has committed a crime, which could be an immigration violation. That could be just the I don't want to say just, but just the crime that is allowing the ICE agents to detain them and research their status. But of that group, 70% have committed an act or has charges against them. That's also interesting because it doesn't mean that they've gone through a full process, even in their own country, their home country, of facing charges. And so that leaves a little bit of blurry lines around the 70%, not blurry lines to the Department of Homeland Security, which is saying, listen, this is like 70%, 7 out of 10 individuals that were taken into custody. First of all, 10 out of 10 have broken the law in some capacity, just under the umbrella of an immigration violation, broken the law. Then in addition, 7 out of 10 of those have these charges, serious criminal charges against them. 7 out of 10. What CBS is saying is, well, wait a minute. We looked at the data and we say it's more like 5 out of 10, just under 50% have criminal convictions. That's not necessarily facing charges or allegations. So they're circling around a number that the public wants, which is, well, how bad are these people? We're hearing from the Department of Homeland Security about these violent criminals that are being taken off the streets, the worst of the worst. But then we're also hearing these other stories. And so just to clarify that a little bit, as much as I possibly can, when you have these battling statistics, what the Department of Homeland Security is saying is, in general, anybody that's in our custody has broken the law, we believe, in some way, either just through their immigration status or in a more serious crime, or is being looked at for a more serious crime. And you could really cut that in both ways, right? Some people in America may look at an immigration violation, let's say for a student, and say, yeah, but that wasn't that student's fault. They came over with their family. They were pursuing asylum. They didn't get permission to stay, but it's not really their fault. So I don't have a problem with them staying in the country versus someone that has a criminal conviction against them, and I want them out. The Department of Homeland Security is saying is that overall, they're pulling out or taking or detaining into custody anyone that has any sort of violation. And so that's what it feels like the American public is wrestling with, based on what I'm hearing from you and also reading, but a lot of interaction with you at Smarter News, which is, I'm not sure where to draw the line. Because if I say 7 out of 10 have criminal convictions that are bad, like, okay, 7 out of 10, but that means 3 out of 10 may not have any criminal convictions at all and could be in that category of someone that's been here for 20 years and has been an amazing member of the community and is doing important things at the local church and is the sort of neighbor that you want. So how do you want to look at that statistic? And if you want to look at the CBS one, same thing. 5 out of 10 criminal convictions of some sort. That means 5 out of 10 don't have it, though. So then where do you want to draw the line? The Minneapolis mayor was back at Face the Nation as well. I want to give you a different perspective. And this was an interesting question about what many of you are bringing up in the live chat, which is, what about this amount of officers that are in Minneapolis? How does that compare to other cities? And his context is important when you hear how many law enforcement officers work for the city of Minneapolis versus how many federal law enforcement officers are estimated to be on the ground. Take a listen.
Through whatever rhetorical flourish you want, but when you have 3,000 ICE agents and border control come to the city, when you've got this supposed threat of 1,500 military coming to the city, yeah, that's very much what it feels like. When you outnumber local police officers 5 and 6 to 1, that is the vibe. And so the bottom line is, if the goal were safety, this is not how you get there. If the goal is safety, I can give you a very antidote to some of the violence that we're seeing, and it's have them leave.
That's the vibe. So he's saying, listen, it just, even just when you are looking at the streets and you're looking at the sheer numbers, this is why he and others feel inundated by federal law enforcement. He says, because we're totally outnumbered and that doesn't feel good. And it's causing more chaos and it's causing more uncertainty. And so, Natalia, you had a great question you were asking right now, which unfortunately I don't know if I have the answer to, but I think it's an important one. You said, how many ICE agents are working in other states? I'm assuming they're working all over, but we're not hearing all this chaos in other states. They are working in other states, but we are surging assets under the Trump administration in certain cities at certain times. So remember, The Minneapolis surge of law enforcement happened in December, January. This is when we've seen a very intense movement of federal officers to this area. This is also happening congruently with questions about fraud in a Democrat-run state. Nick Shirley, a YouTuber over Christmas, the Christmas holiday, a couple days before that, had this video that was seen millions and millions of times. He says exposing the fraud that's happening in Minneapolis and in Minnesota. This has been long documented for more than a decade, but his was a new look at it. And because it's a Democrat-run state and you have a Republican administration, now suddenly we have increased attention. By the way, Nick Shirley is going to be testifying on Capitol Hill this week about his work. So we're seeing all of these different storylines merge together, and there's increased focus in this part of the country. And that doesn't mean we're not going to see it elsewhere. We certainly have seen it elsewhere before, but it's where it's relying right now. So that's where we are, at least in Minnesota. And a question about what's next. Do we see a surge of more federal officers into the area? Do we not? Does it start moving from boiling to more of a simmer? It's hard to know because the protests are ongoing and we don't know what the federal government has planned. I know many of you have asked about the Insurrection Act, which would empower the federal government to put in the U.S. military to places like the city of Minneapolis, if needed. And what I would say about this, just we can get more into it if this becomes more of a serious, imminent situation. Right now, the president mentioned that 5 days ago on social media. We haven't seen a lot of movement after that. I know it's been talked about because it's such a significant, such a significant law to use by the federal government, and often is used when there's a local request for restoring law and order, which is obviously not happening in Minneapolis right now. They're saying we don't want any more federal officers or agents on the ground. We're fine. We're okay by ourselves. So we already have that tension, but it also can happen without a request from the local government. And in fact, I was listening to a really interesting podcast today from the Constitution Center, which is a nonpartisan group. Two different legal analysts were talking about this. I'll put a link in our show notes because it was very good. I had to rewind a couple times. It's a very dense, but I think it's a great starting point for a future interview. You know, there are times in America where the local government is not working on behalf of the Constitution and civil rights. So think about the Ku Klux Klan, for example. There were times where the federal government was mobilized in order to protect the rights, the civil rights, and the Constitution on the ground for U.S. citizens, where the local government wasn't asking for help and was kind of fine with how things were working. So that's an example. It's not just about a request from the local government. It is about an interpretation by the federal government that the local citizens' constitutional rights are being violated and that we have to restore, we meaning the federal government, have to restore law and order. Highly controversial. Not without conflict, not without a lot of opinions. There are some, including one expert that I heard from, that actually thinks this Insurrection Act, as early as it was part of the U.S. Constitution in the 1790s, 1800s, was unconstitutional from the beginning. So it's been debated for many, many decades, and we're not going to resolve it in the next few minutes. But I just want you to know that that's something that we'll keep an eye on. And if it becomes more of a reality, we'll do a deep dive on it for sure. So more on that. Speaking of avoiding conflicts, let's talk a little bit about Greenland. What's happening with Greenland? We're talking so much about it. We're going to need a little historic context for this. But before I get to that, let's just talk about the news. Why are we talking about Greenland again? This is important when covering the Trump administration. I've learned this in the first Trump administration, and it's becoming technicolor in the second Trump administration. What makes it very difficult to cover President Trump. Difficult, I would say challenging, and challenging not necessarily in a negative way, but how you have to get to know a president, how you need to get to know an administration, and how they're using the media and how they're trying to get their priorities across. It's very unique. They have a unique style. And what I've learned is that you have to take President Trump at his word. When he says something, you have to pay attention, because he's going to tell you exactly what he's going to do or what he wants. At the same time, there's always a negotiation happening somewhere. And sometimes it's tough to connect the two. And I'm thinking a lot about that regarding Greenland. Because as you may have noticed, there's a swirl of information regarding Greenland that just sort of came up over the last 3 or 4 days. Isn't that interesting timing? It's right before the president is going to travel to Europe and meet with all these world leaders. And he's threatening tariffs and taxes, threatening all these things. So is it really about Greenland? Probably. Is there also something happening in the background here that maybe we don't know? Maybe. And should we think a little bit about that? Because the timing is important. Increase focus on European relations right before we go overseas and deliver a big speech or have face-to-face meetings. I just want us to keep an eye on that. So the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, was on Meet the Press, and he was asked about what was a new announcement by President Trump. He was angry at our allies. And he says, you're not getting behind me when it comes to the United States taking control of Greenland. And because of that, guess what? You don't get behind me? All right, we're going to put tariffs on your countries. And by the way, that's going to happen as of February 1st, 10% tariff. And if you don't get on board by February 1st, let's say, I don't know, you keep on meandering a little bit, by June 1st, it's going to be 25%. And the countries that we're talking about are Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, UK, Netherlands, and Finland. So important allies and NATO members, the largest military alliance in the world. So here's what Secretary Bessent had to say about this.
Kristen, if we look for years, for over a century, American presidents have wanted to acquire Greenland, and what we can see is that Greenland is essential to the U.S. national security. We're building the Golden Dome, the missile system, and look, President Trump is being strategic. He's looking beyond this year. He's looking beyond next year to what could happen for a battle in the Arctic. We are not going to outsource our national security. We are not going to outsource our hemispheric security to other countries. In Trump 1.0, President Trump told the Europeans, do not build Nord Stream 2. Do not rely on Russian oil. And guess what, Kristen? Guess what is funding Russia's efforts against Ukraine? European purchases of Russian oil. So America has to be in control here.
I want to delve.
Okay, so that's the argument coming from the Trump administration. Listen, this just makes sense. We got to do this, and we're going to get other people on board. So let's talk a little bit about Greenland, and let's talk about attempts over the years for the United States to buy Greenland or take it over in some capacity. Sometimes those things can be a little muddy. You know, when it comes to the case of Alaska, we bought Alaska. When it comes to the case of Hawaii, there was a lot of lead up to what ended up to be U.S. control of Hawaii and then eventually statehood. I asked this question to those who joined us live as part of our insider group when we have a little chit chat before the show. I said, when do you think Alaska and Hawaii actually became states? If I had that question in jeopardy, would I know the answer? And it was a resounding no. I have no idea. I would have thought it was in the late 1800s. I don't know. I probably would have thrown a dart. Did I not pay attention enough in high school? 1959. 1959 was when we added our 2 final states. And yes, there are other territories that have been part of the United States, like Puerto Rico, for more than 100 years. Interestingly enough, do you want to know when we first started to talk about maybe purchasing Greenland? Maybe throwing Iceland in there as well? It was the same person, William Seward, who bought Alaska or helped arrange that purchase, not personally bought Alaska, but arranged that purchase. As that was successful, although it was kind of shrugged at the time, like what were we doing? Until gold was found in Alaska and then oil, and then everyone thought it was a good idea. There was all sorts of questions about adding states when they weren't attached to the mainland. Like, why would we do that? It was all very controversial. But in the aftermath of that, in the glow of their purchase of Alaska, there was conversations about the United States purchasing Greenland and purchasing Iceland. And guess why? Because of the resources there and because of the shipping routes, which is exactly some of the conversation that's happening today. And if we look a little bit into more recent history, what we see is that the way that the United States came together, including the addition of the 2 additional states, Hawaii and Alaska, really came in this post-World War II era. And when we talk about U.S. policy, when it comes to foreign policy, so much of what we're talking about is policy that is post-World War II, that this policy, this perspective, this worldview is having a moment of reckoning. and a question about whether or not we were right at the time and whether or not it applies to our modern world. It's something just to think about. In World War II, the United States took over Greenland and provided full defense of the island. That was something that was established during wartime. So we've had a presence on Greenland before, specifically when it comes to global conflict. And it was President Eisenhower that eventually decided to offer $100 million in gold to buy Greenland from Denmark, but that was rejected. Recent history. This is not, 100 years ago. This is recent history that this was taking place. So you can look at it as this is a new policy of President Trump and this administration, but we also should probably include this historic context that there's been conversations about this for more than 100 years and for very similar reasons. Now, what could this look like? What in the world? Can we just have a moment just to say that out loud? Like, what in the world could this actually look like? Does anyone know? I mean, in the past, we've actually purchased different territories. We actually did that for the U.S. Virgin Island. We purchased the U.S. Virgin Islands from Denmark. So can a similar agreement be reached to purchase Greenland? How would we do that? Where would the money come from? There's some conversation about it coming from tariffs, but there's also a question about whether some of the tariffs, the new tariffs, are legal and whether the Supreme Court is going to allow some of these tariffs to stand in the fashion that they are at this time. So what else could it look like? A military takeover of one of our allies' territories? How would that look? And what are the stakes of that? This is part of the reason why Europe is having this reaction, is because we are part of a military alliance. And so would that break apart? Some are saying, well, that could break apart the military alliance as it stands if the United States comes in and tries to Bigfoot a particular area. Does that not pose the same threat to the rest of us? So it's a conversation that is bringing up a lot of questions, not only about priorities for the United States, but also what does American leadership look like on the global stage right now? I'm curious your thoughts on this. I don't know if I ever thought that I would be alive in a time where the United States would take over another piece of property, for lack of a better term. What would that actually look like? And the reality is that we may be in a situation where we could see that. How would it happen? Tough to try to map out some hypothetics. But I want to show you this real quick before I go. This is a CBS article. I will also link to this on our show notes because I want to show you, first of all, just take in where Greenland is, the largest island in the world. We talked about that last week. We see its proximity to the North Pole and to obviously to Russia. And what you're going to see on your screen here in just a moment, if I can pull it up so it could be a little closer for you watching, and for those of you listening on podcasts, I'll make sure to explain it to you. What we're looking at here is there is a question about, as we see more ice melt, whether or not we could see completely different shipping routes that could change global shipping in a way that would save a lot of money and certainly a lot of time and provide another path for ships that are doing global trade. It's just something to just think about. Here's another example where the shipping routes are from 2006 to 2015. You see all of the shipping routes have to go around to Greenland, around the North Pole, because it's all frozen. But the expectation is in another 20 or so years, it's not going to be as frozen. And we're going to have differing shipping routes. This is why it's being explained as not only a economic play, but also one about national defense, which you heard Secretary Besant talking about, and you heard President Trump talking about as well. So what are your thoughts? Greenland or bust? I feel like we need to go to Greenland, a smarter trip to Greenland. I feel like this is something that we should have on the agenda. Do we have any Greenland audience members? We'd like to know what you think about this. There's been local protests about a takeover by the United States. Can you imagine if you're living there? You have multiple generations living there. What would that be like for you? So we'll see what happens from this point on, but I would pay close attention to what's happening in Davos this week, and we'll see if we get any news. All right, just finally, I thought this was another article I'm going to include in show notes, but I thought if anything, it was something that I hadn't heard about before. We've covered a lot of stories over the last year of the Trump administration, a lot of different ones that we never thought we would cover necessarily. But that's what makes journalism exciting, is the unexpected. But Politico has a list, Politico, the news source, of all the 25 things that, let's see how they titled the article. It's a good one. So I'm going to give them a shout out here. And also Politico is totally based on US politics. So when it comes to something like this, it's interesting to have their perspective. 25 things Donald Trump did this year you might have missed. Okay, some of them you may not have missed, all right? Some of them you're like, yeah, I heard about that. But this is one, for example, the US penny going away. That's something that you've heard a lot about. I haven't heard a lot about psychedelics and animal testing. That's part of this list. But this got my attention here because we have all these questions about property and territory and what's happening at the White House. Did you know this? Apparently, the president seized control of DC public golf courses. There are 3 municipal golf courses located on federal land, according to Politico, run by the nonprofit National Links Trust. And apparently President Trump is eyeing a particular course that is located near the National Mall in the shadow of the Washington Monument, and that privately he has already met with top golf architects in hopes of redesigning DC's public courses. I didn't hear about that. So apparently the administration issued a default notice to the nonprofit that had a lease because they didn't do renovations. And if you see this, let me see if I could show you this picture. It definitely is a, you could look at the course and be like, yeah, I guess it could use a little, I guess it could use a little, sprucing up if one would like to golf. There's a few dirt patches in there that could make, teeing off a little bit more difficult. We know the president loves golf and owns many golf courses, but this is a takeover by the Trump administration that did not reach public outrage. And maybe there's just not enough golf advocates in Washington, D.C., but I do not want you to be surprised if you wake up one day and there's a new shiny golf course in Washington, D.C. I mean, the president's going to be there another 3 years. Right? People complain about him flying to Florida, going up to New Jersey where he has courses. Maybe there just needs to be easy access right there. I don't know how close the other courses are in Virginia, Maryland. I don't know. I don't know enough about golf. But the municipal golf courses, flashpoint that we didn't know. All right. That's all we have for today. Thanks so much for your support of quick, concise, nonpartisan news. Certainly a lot going on. Watch out for the geomagnetic storm fallout. Stay safe wherever you are with this icy, wintry weather that's hitting a broad part of the country. And let me know your thoughts about the last year under the Trump administration. Instead of doing positive or negative, because that gets us into those 2 places, like those 2 camps, why don't you let us know what you're most surprised about? It could be good or bad. What really has caught you off guard? And something totally unexpected. What are your thoughts about that? If you want to send me a voice note, I'd love to include you on one of our podcasts. You can do so hello@smarternews.com. And for our insiders, check out your inboxes. We'll have the full show notes and everything there for you so you can easily surf around, see some of the stuff that we're looking at as we're preparing for the week ahead, and hopefully makes you feel a little bit smarter in one condensed, easy to access space for, as you know, just the price of a cup of coffee once a month. It's a way for you to support Smart News. So thank you so much for that. And thanks for hanging in. But an interesting year. I'm excited about the year ahead and looking forward to spending more time with you. So thank you so much for your support of quick, concise, nonpartisan Smart News. Great day, guys. I'll talk to you later. Bye.